topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome to the Ask the Expert show on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV, where we bring you educational information from top local experts in the fields of legal, health, financial, and home improvement. Now sit back and listen to experts in family law, association law, hearing loss, business brokers, home care, along with many other topics. Now here are your hosts, Steve-O and Sophia.
Hey, good afternoon, California. Welcome to another Ask the Expert show. For the last 16 years, we have brought you the top experts in the field of legal, health, financial, and home improvement. Hey, today we've got an exciting show for the next 50 minutes, Mesothelioma. It took me a year to be able to pronounce that. So we have got one of the greatest law firms with attorney Michael Mandelbrot. And I got to tell you that if you know someone or you have a family member who have suffered from this, you need to contact Michael. Good afternoon, Michael.
Steve, thank you for the introduction. Always great to see you. And, I really do appreciate that. And, I'll add, whether it's mesothelioma or other asbestos diseases, lung cancer, asbestosis, and oftentimes, other cancers like laryngeal cancer or colorectal cancers, these can also be caused by exposures to asbestos. And that is exactly what my office specializes in, helping victims of asbestos-related diseases. So always great to see you.
Thank you. Michael, what made you decide to go into this area of law?
When I got out of law school, I just wanted a job. And it just so happened that there was a law firm right in my hometown that I applied for a job, Novato, California. And they were a firm that represented victims of asbestos diseases. This was over 30 years ago. And admittedly, when I started, I had no idea even what asbestos really was. And hopefully I can educate a lot of the listeners now. But I had no idea. But I knew they had a lot of work. And it was a paycheck at the time, and that's sort of how I got started. There was a book that I read, very similar to the Aaron Brockovich movie, and the name escapes me. It's not A Civil Action, but it's very similar to that. Outrageous Misconduct by Paul Brodeur. And once I read that book, Outrageous Misconduct, I was literally hooked, because what I learned was these asbestos companies knew for decades that their products, insulation, brakes, boilers, railroad cars, you name it, they knew that their products were causing very serious and fatal diseases and cancers. They hid the information and they kept selling their products for decades. So now that, the public became more educated and we learned about the hazards to asbestos and what these companies knew, it sort of became a mission of mine or a dedication to help these people, these victims, typically blue-collar workers, veterans, members of the military, since there was so much asbestos used there, to help these people. And so that's sort of how I got involved.
I got to tell you, I think God placed you in this area, and I'm going to tell people why. I mean, your clients are in a no survival mode. You have got to have a heart, you've got to be a special person to work with either a person who has contacted this or family members. It just takes a certain type person with a certain heart like you have, Michael.
I appreciate that because I think there is a passion that's involved and an understanding that when you meet with these clients, it may be the only time that you ever see them because oftentimes they may pass away within weeks, months, days. I've been in the middle of a deposition where we did day 2 of a deposition and the guy didn't make it to day 3. I've done depositions in hospitals, and so it is really difficult. You really have to have a heavy heart for not just the victims but their families. Oftentimes these people have been married 40 and 50 years, and the wife and the family is losing the only person they know. I did want to quickly touch on something. Out there for the listeners, you probably see mesothelioma commercials all the time on television. And, Steve mentioned that I am different. And, we've probably done about, 15 of these podcasts, maybe even 20. And, I've tried to sort of bite my tongue a little bit. And in the past couple weeks, something happened, and what Steve just mentioned, I'm not going to sort of bite my tongue as much anymore. And that is, these firms that you see that advertise on TV, you do not want to go with them. Just this past week, and I'm just going to hold this up real quick, and then I'm going to read it in. There was an article about the biggest mesothelioma and asbestos firm in the country. And it says, gory firm accused of fraud, racketeering, bounties in asbestos litigation.
Wow.
And so you look at this, and what you read in here is it said they had a long-running scheme to create a system of bounties, deception, and other tactics to back up the filing of hundreds of baseless claims to secure billions of dollars in settlements allegedly based on fraud. And the thing that really bothers me is that billions of dollars that they've secured for victims, them, and it's not just them. There's other big firms on TV. You see the James Sokoloff firm, all his cases go to this Gorey firm. That's where his cases go, to the Gorey firm and the Simmons firm, who was also sued for racketeering. And, the complaint mentions the Sokoloff firm in here. And these are the guys who advertise on TV, who get most of the cases. And it says here that they secure, and this is only allegations, billions of dollars allegedly based on fraud. What they don't realize is that's billions of dollars that should go to actual victims, to my clients and every other asbestos victim from now until the end of time. But by them taking those billions of dollars in funds out of this limited pool of money for victims, out of what I believe is, pure greed, in essence, because they could make a lot of money anyways, but it's not enough. And there's multiple big firms that do this. And, when I do the math, there has probably been, as I call it, the largest coordinated fraud in legal history, where $15 billion, I believe, has been misappropriated from victims to lawyers like these and the other big firms. And I've seen this happening for 10 or 15 years, and I've I've obviously bit my tongue for the most part in these podcasts, but I do think it is important that anybody out there do your research. These are very valuable cases that take a lot of research, investigation, and time. And the recovery can be very large for victims, but the fact that lawyers who tout to represent victims are actually stealing from victims, and every victim from now till the end of time with this $15 billion gone, it is a little bit frustrating. And I do like to think that I am different. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but hey, Steve, I thought it was a good time to bring it up.
Hey, I got to tell you, I got so many things to share with you today. First of all, the firm that you mentioned contacted me about 4 years ago. And what I didn't like about the firm is, to me, it seemed like they didn't really handle mesothelioma. They just contracted it out, that you weren't really getting that firm. And that was like, well, who am I dealing with? You or, other firms? It's like you were just sending out business. So we passed on a very big deal. But I want to tell people something. There is a pretty legitimate firm, one of the biggest firms, that actually listens to this show, several of their attorneys. And they told me that Michael, the information that he provides us every month is right on. And it was so good, they wanted a show of their own, but we just deal with Michael's firm. But that was the most incredible compliment, and that they still listen to the show. But you're right. I'm so glad you brought that out to people, because there's a lot of people, a lot of firms, Michael, that advertise on a national basis. So people think, oh, they must be big and they're good. That has nothing to do with it. I got to tell you, I would much prefer to go with Michael's firm than any larger firm, because, Michael, I said this before, I'm going to say it again. You care so much about your client.
I do. There's a piece of me that, when any client passes, I feel like a little piece of me passes.
I understand.
These are, just like, somebody who touched your life that, and you had an opportunity to impact their life that you're never going to see again. And these big firms, when they have hundreds of clients, they don't have that same passion for each individual client. Sure, there may be clients along the way that they develop a relationship with, but it's not the same. And I know that, and it is it's hard to compete against these big firms, but I think understanding, what I represent versus what they represent is what allows me to keep going forward. Because it is very hard to compete when these firms are spending literally $3 million, $4 million a month on these TV ads. Not a lot of us have that money to go around, but now we see when it says that they've secured billions in fees and settlements based on fraud. Now we see why they've got that $3 million a month to spend on this type of thing.
And Michael, people don't know this until they've actually secured your services. You do so much work before you realize your first dime.
Absolutely. And it's not just the financial commitment, which is extensive before we see any money, probably $50,000 to $100,000 out of pocket in a large mesothelioma case. But also the time commitment and the research that it takes in these cases, because finding one company or one defendant that exposed your client to asbestos can mean potentially millions of dollars in settlements for your client. And what makes it so difficult is when someone's exposed to asbestos, and this is good education for the listeners, you never get sick right away. You don't get sick in 5 years. I think the minimum latency I've ever heard an expert testify to is maybe 10 to 12 years between exposure and development of disease. But from my experience, it's more like 30 and 35 years that we have to go back and determine how was someone exposed to asbestos 30 and 35 years ago. And when you say there's a huge commitment, it's not just a huge financial commitment, it's a huge amount of research and time to determine the proper companies to name in these cases so that you can do the best for your client. I see it all of the time. This firm is a perfect example. The Gorey firm, the other firm who I mentioned, the Simmons firm, they start in Madison County, Illinois, then they open up an office in New York, and they all end up opening offices in California. But the fact is, they don't know the California defendants. They don't know all of the different companies who made, sold, supplied, and distributed asbestos here. But they set up shop just to gather more cases and gather more cases when they don't, even know many of the defendants who they should be naming in their cases, and ultimately leaving, millions of dollars on the table for their clients. Maybe they're securing it, we're learning, through fraud, but they're leaving money on the table by not doing the research, which for me, it probably took me 10 years before I had a full picture or understanding of the asbestos defendants here. And, for them to just open up shop and file 30 cases or 50 cases, they're leaving money on the table. There's no question about it.
You know what else, Michael, I love about your firm? Somebody can call you up, and because of your experience, you can tell somebody basically if they have a case or not. And that is so important because some of these firms are going to blow smoke up and make you feel like you've got to. Michael's going to be very direct, and he's basically going to know if you have a case.
Well, you're very, very accurate. What you mentioned about these other attorneys blowing smoke is something that, does impact me a lot. And it just impacted me in the past week because there was a client, and it ironically happened to be a client. Oh, it actually wasn't the Gorey firm. It was another firm. I won't mention them, back east, who took in the case and told this client that they were going to get them millions of dollars. They blew smoke. They retained the case. 6 months, 9 months, a year into the case, they basically must have realized, hey, we're not going to be able to help this client. And they kicked him to the curb and they just dumped the client completely.
Wow.
The client calls me and says, is there anything you can do? I talked to this Sage firm. They said they could get me X, Y, and Z. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to mention this. They talked to this firm. They said they could get me X, Y, and Z. And now, they've dropped my case. And so I end up getting them. And right away, I tell them, look, this is what I think I can do. And this is what I think your case is worth. But that blowing smoke that the other lawyer did gets in the client's head, where they believe still to this day that they've got a case that may be worth $1 million. And where I got them settlements, which I knew were good settlements, and they were maybe about $30,000 total, not a ton of money, but also it wasn't a client with mesothelioma or extensive exposures to asbestos. They were in the Navy, but they didn't have a lot of exposures post-Navy. And I was happy to get him these settlements. I called him up. I was excited. Hey, we passed these claims. It's going to be 30,000. And they're like, is this all we're going to get? Is that all? And so it ends up being 15 minutes explaining to them that, hey, look, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to meet your expectations after these other attorneys blow smoke.
But they got him nothing, though, Michael. They got him zero.
Exactly. And that's what I try to tell them is, hey, look, I could have just not taken your case and you get zero. I saw this at the outset. I knew we could pass these claims. We passed them. This is what they pay. We don't have any control here. They did ultimately accept it and send back the releases, I will say. But, these firms that blow smoke, I like to tell people this is what your case may have a potential based on my experience, but no promises. And very quickly, I can look at a case based on because of my experience, based on where they were exposed, what jurisdiction that case is going to be filed in, who the defendants are in that case. I can get a pretty good idea of what a case has the potential to be worth. But, there could be a case that, we think might be a $3 or $4 million case. And then after investigation, it ultimately is a $10 million case, or, vice versa. We think there might be a case that may be a $5 million case. Ultimately, it turns out it's not mesothelioma, it's lung cancer. The exposure doesn't hold up and it ends up being, maybe $500,000 case instead of $5 million. And so it can work both ways. And so I never want to make promises to a client, because then you're always straddled with these expectations. And I don't want to get straddled with this. I just want to do my best and tell them, hey, look, we did everything we can do for you. And here's what we got. And to this point, I've never had a client be upset with that.
Michael, I'm going to ask you a question I have never asked before. First of all, we have got so many questions from our listeners.
What?
I'm going to ask you a question that nobody can do in a 30-second commercial. Tell people, and I know every case is different, but just take an average case. Walk us through what you say to a person or their family.
Well, the first thing I like to say is, when is the next time you're available to meet face to face? Because the first thing I want to do, whether it's get on a plane that day, the next day, is meet face to face with a client. The next thing I, want to make clear to them is that, the most important thing is your health and enjoying however much life you have left. Whether a doctor has told you it's 6 months, 2 months, let's just throw all those things out and let's just plan on being here as long as we can, and staying positive. With regards to the case, what I like to, reinforce to them is, look, your time on this earth is valuable, and I want to make this process as easy as possible for you. The first thing I like to tell them is what their time commitment is going to be in a case, which is typically, besides the meetings with the attorney, the big thing is a videotape deposition, where we've got to come out to their home and spend time, a significant amount of time with them. And there will be lawyers on Zoom asking them questions, defendants, about their asbestos exposure. That may take a week. Other than that, 95% of these cases settle based on, your disease and your exposure. These are what my expectations are. I also want to let them know that I know my fee contract is the lowest in the country. I want the most money to go to them because they're the ones who deserve it. We're going to do fine, even making 1/3 where other firms take 40%, and let them, know a little bit about the process of the litigation. When the case we expect to file, when we'd serve the defendants, when we expect the deposition, and of course, when they can start seeing money. Because in these cases, there's never one unless you only have one defendant like Johnson & Johnson in a case, you typically have multiple defendants, maybe 20, 30, as well as 20 or 30 bankruptcy claims. And that means the potential for getting 50 different checks from 50 different defendants. You're not going to get, like in a car accident case, you might get one big check if you settle the case. In these cases, it might be a check for $125,000, a check for $20,000, a check for $300,000, a check for $18,000. And each one represents a defendant who we settled with, a check for $750,000 if it's one of the target defendants. And it all will, and we like to tell them you'll probably start seeing your first checks within this amount of time, and which typically is a month. But if any of these clients, especially those who have mesothelioma, if they ever need advances on their settlements, I know that I'm always willing to give them whatever they need so that their lives are, the rest of their lives are lived in peace, as peaceful as they can be, whether that means money for food for their family because they can't work, money for their medical care, because I know that ultimately their case is going to reimburse this money. And so, I want to let them know that they don't have a lot to worry about financially going forward. Just enjoy your life, because I don't want to talk a lot about the law. I want to be more of a person, a human being to them than a lawyer. And if they want a lawyer, I can wear that hat too and talk about the litigation and deposition, in details, but that's not really who I am. So,
what are some of the questions you ask them about their health that can kind of give you an idea if there is a case there?
Well, typically, if the first thing that we talk about when, I'm always contacted on the phone initially, is what they've been diagnosed with. We get that out of the way. And so they'll mention either cancer, lung cancer, mesothelioma, or I think asbestosis, I'm having breathing problems. So if it's cancer, either lung cancer or meso, those are diagnosed through a biopsy typically, and the client that will be reviewed by a pathologist who does a pathology report to determine the type of cancer. So my questions will usually revolve around when did they have their biopsy? How did they get informed of the results? Because I get calls, I have to say, a lot from people who say, I've got that meso, I've got that meso, but they don't have meso. They, probably 8 out of 10 who call and say they do typically don't, because they haven't been diagnosed through a biopsy and by a pathologist. So if it's cancer, my first questions always revolve around the biopsy, their treatment, what did the doctors tell them? If it's asbestosis, I talk about the symptoms they're having, difficulty walking upstairs, and I also want to know about their exposures. I'm hoping that they had appreciable exposures to asbestos. If a guy says, well, yeah, there was that one time I did that brake job for my buddy, but they sold insurance their whole life, and they're having breathing problems, I'm thinking that guy probably smoked a lot, if he's having breathing problems, because a lot of people who smoked were also exposed to asbestos, and it doesn't mean they don't have a case, but I like to know whether or not they did have a significant exposure to asbestos. So medically for them, my questions would just be, tell me a little bit about your breathing. When do you have difficulty? Are you on oxygen? Have you had what's known as a pulmonary function test or a breathing test with your doctor? Those tests to me are fairly significant and are significant in our litigation, because there's all these scores that it is read by a pulmonologist, and we can also determine from those scores whether or not typically their breathing problems are caused by smoking or caused by asbestos. And there's certain scores in there that I am now trained to be able to read. So I'll ask them whether they've had those sorts of things.
You know what's interesting, Michael? I'm looking at all the people who wrote questions in and their city, and like Baltimore, San Diego, Los Angeles, Galveston. These are all areas on the water.
You got it.
Isn't Baltimore where they built ships at also?
All four of the places that you mentioned had extensive shipbuilding activities. We've got records on all those places. There's lots of cases, but also Baltimore had a lot of steel. Texas has in the oil industry, oil and gas industry, and California's got had all of the above as well. So, when you've got those big industries, it's not a surprise. But especially, you named it. These cases, from my experience, started with insulators, Navy insulators primarily.
Hey, this is our first time in well over a year. We just got a text from an attorney. Listen to this, Michael. He said, I listen to your show all the time. I am not as extensive into mesothelioma as you are. My question is, do you ever find where a doctor misdiagnosed asbestos or mesothelioma? Wow.
We do find misdiagnosis, and oftentimes you might see language like it may be in the report, or it's suspicious for mesothelioma. And ultimately, these another pathologist may look at it and say, no, this has the markings of an adenocarcinoma or a different type of cancer. But we also see, for example, oftentimes, because mesothelioma can be on, or is most often seen on, the lining of the lungs and the abdomen, which is known as peritoneal mesothelioma. And we have seen those misdiagnosed as ovarian cancer, and it ultimately proves to be a mesothelioma. And so the answer to his question is yes. I think I talked earlier in this podcast about the Gorey firm about 20 years ago. I'd say even more, 30 years ago, when I first got into this litigation, and it was primarily in Texas. These doctors were seeing hundreds and hundreds of people a day, and every single one of them were diagnosed with asbestos disease. And, clearly there was a lot of misdiagnosis there, a lot of fraud there by the doctors in that situation. So we have seen that. I am always very suspicious of these doctors, but the one thing this texter needs to understand is, we're only the lawyers. We're not the doctors. These are experts trained in the medical field. And, we send cases to them all the time where they come back and they say, I see no markings of asbestos-related disease, or this is not an asbestos-related cancer. The only cases that you hear about are the ones that are filed because those are the asbestos-related diseases. So the ones where they do diagnose them. And these doctors are also trained above and beyond the normal medical training. They've got to be what's known as a certified B reader, which allows them, where they're trained to read x-rays and CT scans in a different way from a normal radiologist. And they need a higher certification. So if they've got that higher certification and they diagnose them, I do typically trust that diagnosis. But what the texter doesn't see is all the times they come back and they say, no, this guy who you just spent money on me on and who you did an intake on and you got all his records, he doesn't have an asbestos disease. And I've got to reject that case. And so you only hear about the cases that are filed. But yes, there are misdiagnoses. And also, God, I'm forgetting the term right now, but it's a diagnosis of, in essence, one or the other. It may be mesothelioma or this, but it's one or the other. And in those cases, we have a tough time proving to a jury it's meso when even our doctor says it's one or the other. So we do see misdiagnoses, but what you don't see is all the times that these intakes are rejected because our doctor determines that they don't have an asbestos disease and it's caused by something else. And I don't know what that is, but I know it's not asbestos, so I can't help them.
I'm going to tell you something also I've never shared with you. I got to tell you how important this category is, because when I go the internet every day doing research and due diligence, and I can't tell you how many ads I see from law firms regarding mesothelioma. And I got to tell you, I love that Michael Vanderbroek, that this is the only thing he concentrates on. Because I would look up some of these other firms. They do personal injury, they do workers' comp. They got a whole list of shingles of what they do. You just concentrate in this one area. And it's amazing. I was just thinking about this text that we got. You never know who's listening. Michael, I want to get to, God, we got so many questions. We're going to have to go to these next month. But Craig in Baltimore, he said, what are the different compensation options available for mesothelioma patients?
I'll try and keep this answer short. But for mesothelioma patients, the two big ones that we handle, we don't handle workers' comp, which is another one, but the big one is a third-party lawsuit suing solvent defendants who you can prove exposed that victim of mesothelioma to asbestos. That is one source of compensation. The second source of compensation are what we call asbestos bankruptcy trust funds. There used to be $70 billion. Now there's $20 billion, part of what I talked about earlier. But there is still $20 billion in these asbestos trust funds for victims. That is the second source of compensation, is filing claims with these asbestos trust funds. So mesothelioma, they walk in my office, I am 100% certain I am going to be able to get them compensation from, there hasn't been a case, both sources, solvent defendants as well as from the asbestos trust funds. How much? We don't know, but like I like to say, unlike 99% of other non-asbestos attorneys out there, we've got skin in the game in every case. We take every case on a contingency. Never do we bill by the minute, by the hour, by the job, by anything. Every case is handled on a contingency. So we've got skin in the game in every single case, and that's very important to us.
That means the more you get your client, the more you will eventually make.
Absolutely. So we want to make as much as we can for our clients, because then we make, more as an office, and that's the hope.
I got to tell you, I'm still getting over that text we got. You never know who's listening or watching the show. Here's Jack in San Diego. He wants to know, do I have to file a lawsuit to get a mesothelioma settlement?
Hey, Jack, no, you don't actually. As I mentioned, we sue solvent defendants. In that case, yes, you do have to file a lawsuit. But those asbestos bankruptcy trust funds, we have clients all the time who just say, we don't want to go through a lawsuit. That's just not our style. We don't want to sue anybody. And in those cases, we tell them, you're leaving a lot of money on the table, because there may be solvent defendants we can get money from. But if you don't want to file a lawsuit, we don't have to. And we can still get you compensation from these asbestos trust funds without ever filing a lawsuit. You'll never have to deal with another lawyer. There's no depositions. All we need is your okay to file these claims, and we can get you the compensation.
I read a story about a person in the military who they felt like they were exposed to asbestos. Would you be suing the military?
No, that is, there's a few entities that we cannot sue. I mentioned we don't do workman's comp cases. We can't go after employers. They are exempted. The sole source of recovery against employers is in the workman's compensation arena, and we don't handle those. The other one who has full immunity is the military. We cannot sue any branch of the military at all. Now, don't get me wrong, 90% of our clients were in the military. We can still go after contractors who handled asbestos there, suppliers of asbestos to the military. And so military claimants are very valuable to us, but not against the military. And I will quickly say, it is interesting you mentioned that, because in cases that actually do go to verdict and they attribute a percentage of fault, like they might say GE was 20% responsible. Oftentimes, and I've seen this a lot, they will attribute a percentage to the Navy and say the Navy was 30% responsible. But that doesn't mean you get 30% of that verdict from the Navy. That's just what the jury says, that they are in part responsible. If they did not have that immunity, yes, we could sue them, but the government is immune. And, very quickly as well, we don't typically sue school districts, hospitals. We could if we wanted to. We may sue colleges or universities, but not like a small local school district, even though we could. And those are just moral choices that we make. And we talk to our clients about that, whether they want us to. And a lot of times, do you want to, if you can get full recovery for your client without suing, the local school district who may be responsible as well, then those are moral choices that have to be made amongst lawyers. So, no, we don't sue the military. Others, morally, I try not to sue.
What about if a person doesn't remember where they contacted asbestos? Can you still sue?
Absolutely. Once we talk with them about their work history and where they worked, we are typically able to enlighten them as to how asbestos was used in their work environments, how they could have been exposed but had no idea they were exposed because maybe the guy next to them was using it on the job site, or maybe another building product that was used on the job site had it. Because how most people get exposed is when asbestos becomes respirable, dusty, floor tile is cut, drywall is sanded, insulation is cut, and then dust gets into the air. It becomes respirable. And so a lot of people who have been diagnosed, they don't even know they were exposed because they don't know what the guy next to them was using and what was in those products. But we can typically enlighten and educate them by walking them through their work history, talking to them about their jobs, what trades were on the jobs, what products, what types of equipment. And, ultimately, we can almost always find a defendant. And very quickly, because I know our time is running out, somebody called me, a lawyer who represents people in the railroad, thousands and thousands. And he goes, yeah, somebody's daughter was, who wasn't in the railroad, is like 36 years old and was just diagnosed with mesothelioma. And he's like, you can't do anything with that case now. And I'm like, Bruce, that is a $20 million case, potentially more, because as we've learned, maybe she was exposed to Johnson & Johnson's baby powder. And a lot of people didn't know Johnson & Johnson's baby powder. So,
Right.
Most people think of insulation and Navy and those sorts of things. But, the Christmas tree flock used to have asbestos in it.
Wow.
So you just never know. You just never know. And that's why a big part of our job's investigation.
I got to get this last text in. This is from Ruby in San Mateo. I heard about your show, started watching it, which I normally do with these type of shows, and I put it down after 5 minutes. I have been on for the last 30 minutes of your show. I just wanted to say, I never write into shows like this, but I wanted to say, Michael, you are God sent. I wish there was more lawyers out there like you. That's pretty cool.
It's awesome. And you're in San Mateo. You're close to me. You're in the 415. It's probably a cold, breezy day out there like it is for me. But feel free to give me a call sometime. And if you ever do happen to run into someone diagnosed, please have them give me a call anytime. My number's scrolling right there across the screen, 415-895-5175, direct to my office.
What about, do you have a website, Michael?
We do. It is mesothelioma, mesothelioma.pro. Mesothelioma.pro, not .com. That's another law firm.
Michael will be back again with us next month, as always. Bro, I love doing your show. And if we can just touch one person, thank you so much for your knowledge and basically for how you handle your business. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Steve, for producing, and I appreciate everything. I look forward to seeing you next month.
Okay, buddy. Take care. Stay warm. We'll see you soon.
Right. See you soon. Thanks.
That's attorney Michael Vanderbroek. Folks, if you know someone who might be suffering from mesothelioma or asbestos, I'm telling you, give Michael a call. He will give you the right information. And if you've got a case, he can handle it for you. Hey, that's it for us today. We'll see you again next week with more Ask the Experts.
Thanks for tuning in today to the Ask the Experts show on W4CY Radio and Talk4 TV. Tune in next week and every week to hear more from our experts on personal injury, insurance, air condition repairs, estate planning, Medicare, and many other topics in the areas of legal, health, financial, and home improvement. See you next week.